What began as a serene journey quickly spiraled into pandemonium when a flight attendant unexpectedly dialed the police over a pregnant passenger. Yet an astonishing twist just 5 minutes later left everyone utterly speechless. Before we dive into the full story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if riveting tales like this captivate you, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. The flight was bustling with the usual pre-departure energy. Passengers were finding their seats, overhead bins were being filled, and a faint hum of conversation filled the air. Celeste Mirage stepped into the cabin with a graceful air that belied the weariness of her long journey. Clad in a maternity dress that combined comfort with understated elegance, she moved deliberately, each step a quiet testament to her resilience. Her posture hinted at both the gentle burden of pregnancy and the silent determination of a mother. Beside her, her young daughter, no more than 6 years old, clutched her hand tightly, her eyes wide with innocent wonder as she absorbed every detail of this new adventure. In one hand, Celeste held a neatly tucked boarding pass proudly stamped first class, while a small, well-traveled bag swung gently from her shoulder. As she strolled down the aisle, a polite smile illuminated her face when she exchanged greetings with the crew near the entrance. Yet, amid the routine nods and smiles, one crew member's lingering glance disrupted the calm. A look that flickered from curiosity to something less certain as it shifted between Celeste and her daughter. Settling into her designated seat at the very front of the cabin, Celeste carefully arranged her daughter next to her, tucking away her bag and allowing herself a brief, weary moment of repose. The quiet of the cabin was almost a promise of peace, until that momentary shift in attention drew her eyes to Vesper Rune, who now stood a short distance away with an expression that had transformed from casual cordiality to a reserved intensity. Vesper Rune approached, her smile now replaced with a polite but clipped expression. "Excuse me, ma'am," Vesper Rune said, her tone firm yet rehearsed. "May I see your boarding pass?" Celeste Mirage blinked in confusion but handed over the pass without hesitation. "Sure," she said, her voice calm but a little surprised. She watched Vesper Rune scan the pass. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the details. "This is for first class?" Vesper Rune asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yes, that's correct," she replied. Vesper Rune's lips pressed together tightly as she handed the boarding pass back without a word. She turned and walked toward the galley, where another flight attendant joined her. The two spoke in hushed tones, but their eyes flicked in Celeste Mirage's direction. Celeste Mirage felt the stares but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on calming her daughter, who was getting fidgety in her seat. Moments later, Vesper Rune returned, this time with a more rigid posture. Her smile was gone, replaced with a look of authority. "Ma'am, I'll need you to come with me for a moment," she said, gesturing toward the front of the plane. Celeste Mirage frowned, the first hint of irritation crossing her face. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Vesper Rune didn't answer directly. "We just need to verify something with your booking. Please bring your belongings." Passengers nearby began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the growing tension. Celeste Mirage sighed but complied, standing up slowly and retrieving her bag. Her daughter looked at her, confused. "It's okay, sweetie, just stay here for a moment," Celeste Mirage said softly, giving the little girl a reassuring smile before following Vesper Rune down the aisle. Vesper Rune led her toward the front galley, stopping just before the curtain that separated the first-class cabin from the rest of the plane. "There seems to be an issue with your seat," Vesper Rune said, folding her arms. "I believe this seat might have been assigned in error." Celeste Mirage's patience began to thin, though her voice remained steady. I booked these seats weeks ago, and they were confirmed. There's no mistake. Vesper Rune's tone turned colder. I'll need to confirm that with the gate staff. For now, you'll need to wait here. Celeste Mirage's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She stood there, her hand clutching her bag, while Vesper Rune disappeared behind the curtain, leaving her alone in the small space around her. The murmurs of passengers grew louder, and Celeste Mirage could feel their eyes on her through the curtain. Her daughter peeked over the back of her seat, looking for her mom. Celeste Mirage gave her a quick wave, her calm smile returning, though inside, frustration simmered. Something about this didn't feel right, but Celeste Mirage had a way of keeping her emotions under control, even when others tried to strip away her dignity. She had dealt with worse. Vesper Rune's return would soon prove to be far more troubling than Celeste Mirage could have anticipated. Vesper Rune returned moments later, this time with 2 police officers trailing behind her. Their crisp uniforms seemed strangely incongruent with the intimate confines of the aircraft, instantly drawing the attention of nearly every passenger in the first-class cabin. Celeste Mirage's eyes widened imperceptibly, though she maintained her graceful composure. She subtly adjusted her posture, her hand instinctively drifting to rest protectively over her stomach. One of the officers, a tall man with a serious expression, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've been informed there may be an issue with your seating arrangement. Could you please provide us with your boarding pass?" Celeste Mirage's voice was calm but firm. "I've already shown my pass to the flight attendant. It's valid. I don't understand why this is escalating." She reached into her bag and handed the pass to the officer. Vesper Rune lingered to the side, her arms folded and her expression smug, as if she were certain the officers would soon confirm her suspicions. Around them, passengers exchanged furtive glances. Some whispered softly, while others discreetly pulled out their phones to record the unfolding scene. The officer scrutinized the boarding pass, his brow furrowing as he met Celeste Mirage's steady gaze. "This does appear to be valid, ma'am. Did anyone explain why there's an issue?" Celeste Mirage shot a measured glance toward Vesper Rune, who deliberately avoided eye contact. "No," she replied firmly. "No one has given me a reason why I was asked to leave my seat." The officer then turned his attention back to Vesper Rune, his expression neutral, yet his tone edged with quiet authority. "Is there something specific we're missing here? The boarding pass is valid." Vesper Rune hesitated, her usual confidence wavering for the first time. "It just didn't seem right," she stammered. "You don't typically see someone like that booking first class." The officer's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening slightly. "Are you saying this is based on an assumption, not on any actual violation of policy?" Vesper Rune's face flushed red, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The other officer, a woman with a steady demeanor, stepped in. "Ma'am," she said to Celeste Mirage, "it seems there's no valid reason for this escalation. You're welcome to return to your seat." Celeste Mirage looked at Vesper Rune, her expression a mix of exhaustion and restrained anger. She remained silent, her quiet demeanor speaking volumes where words could not. Nodding slightly to the officer, she turned to head back to her seat, until a sudden commotion at the entrance halted everyone in their tracks. A tall woman in a crisp airline uniform entered the cabin, her badge identifying her as a supervisor. Her gaze was sharp as it swept over Celeste Mirage, the officers, and Vesper Rune. "What's going on here?" the supervisor demanded, her voice carrying authority as she stepped forward, clearly determined to regain control of the situation. Vesper Rune opened her mouth to explain, but Celeste Mirage spoke first. "Apparently, I didn't seem like someone who belongs in first class," she said, her voice steady but edged with frustration. The supervisor's eyes flashed as she turned to Vesper Rune. "Is this true?" she asked sharply. Vesper Rune stammered, her confidence crumbling further under the supervisor's piercing gaze. The tension in the cabin thickened as passengers leaned in, their curiosity palpable. The supervisor's steady stare held Vesper Rune in place as she fumbled with her words. I thought there might have been a mix-up," Vesper Rune stuttered. "It was just a precaution." The supervisor folded her arms, her expression hardening. "A precaution based on what, exactly?" "This passenger has a valid boarding pass, and you escalated this to the point of calling law enforcement. Do you understand how serious this is?" Vesper Rune's face flushed. "I was just following protocol, she repeated. The supervisor's tone was sharp. "Now, the protocol does not involve making baseless assumptions about passengers and disrupting an entire cabin. Do you realize how this reflects on the airline?" Celeste Mirage, still standing quietly nearby, finally spoke, her voice calm but pointed. "This isn't just about assumptions. It's about how certain people are judged before they even have a chance to prove themselves. This situation was humiliating and unnecessary." The supervisor nodded, her expression softening slightly as she turned to Celeste Mirage. "Miss Mirage, I deeply apologize for this incident. It should never have happened." Her words were genuine, yet Celeste Mirage's expression remained unreadable. Passengers, previously murmuring, now fell silent as all eyes shifted between Celeste Mirage, Vesper Rune, and the supervisor. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of the moment was unmistakable. The supervisor then addressed the officers, her tone firm but professional. "Thank you for your time, but your presence is no longer required. This matter will be handled internally." The officers exchanged a brief, understanding look before nodding and departing, their exit leaving an uncomfortable stillness hanging over the cabin. Celeste Mirage stepped aside gracefully to let them pass, her poise unshaken amid the unfolding turbulence. The supervisor then turned her steely gaze toward Vesper Rune. "You're relieved of your duties effective immediately. Collect your belongings and disembark. I will be filing a report to management, and this will be reviewed at the highest level." Vesper Rune opened her mouth as if to protest, but the supervisor's unwavering expression silenced her instantly. With a flushed face and hurried, stiff steps, she made her way toward the galley, vanishing behind the curtain. Around her, passengers exchanged glances, some with a sense of vindication, others with disbelief at the dramatic turn of events. The supervisor then faced Celeste Mirage once more. "Please return to your seat, Miss Mirage. I assure you this matter will be addressed appropriately. If there's anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable, don't hesitate to let me know." Celeste Mirage nodded once, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you. I appreciate your efforts." As she resumed her journey back to her seat, she felt the weight of every gaze tracking her movement. Her daughter, eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and worry, looked up as they neared their row. Leaning down to gently smooth her daughter's hair, Celeste whispered, "Everything's fine now, sweetheart," though deep down she sensed that the ramifications of this encounter reached far beyond a single flight. Settling into her seat once again, with her daughter resting her head on her shoulder, Celeste sensed the quiet tension still lingering in the refined confines of first class. A few passengers offered sympathetic looks, while others deliberately avoided her gaze, each silently acknowledging the storm that had just passed. She reached for her phone and began scrolling through her contacts with determined purpose. At that moment, a young flight attendant, distinguished from Vesper Rune by her warm demeanor, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, can I get you anything? Water, a blanket for your daughter?" she asked, her tone imbued with a gentle apology. Celeste Mirage offered a small, grateful smile as she responded, "We're fine, thank you, but I'd appreciate it if you could make sure my daughter has her meal first. She gets fussy when she's hungry." "Of course," the attendant replied, nodding quickly before stepping away. Celeste Mirage could sense the shift in behavior. Although the crew now appeared noticeably more attentive, she couldn't help but wonder whether their concern was genuine or merely an act of damage control. In the galley, Vesper Rune slumped on a small stool with her head in her hands, still haunted by the echo of the supervisor's harsh reprimand. A swirl of frustration and panic churned in her mind as she grappled with the reality of being publicly admonished for the first time. For a fleeting moment, she considered texting her partner about the incident, but she hesitated, unsure how to convey the inexplicable turn of events. Soon, the supervisor re-entered the galley, her sharp eyes locking onto Vesper Rune. "I told you to collect your things. You shouldn't still be here," she declared. Startled, Vesper Rune abruptly rose, fumbling with her bag as she tried to form an explanation. This wasn't what I meant to happen." "I didn't think," the supervisor interjected firmly. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't think. You acted on a baseless assumption, and now it's become a public spectacle. This isn't merely a mistake, Vesper Rune, it's a failure to honor the trust our passengers place in us." Overwhelmed by humiliation, Vesper Rune's cheeks burned as she muttered, "I understand," her eyes fixed on the floor. The supervisor continued, "You have a chance to explain yourself in the disciplinary hearing, but for now, I suggest you leave quietly." With a resigned nod, Vesper Rune slung her bag over her shoulder and pushed past the curtain, exiting the aircraft hastily, with her head bowed, deliberately avoiding the area where passengers lingered. Celeste Mirage then tapped out a succinct yet deliberate message on her phone. "Incident on Flight 2467. Details to follow. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again." After sending the message, she carefully stowed her phone away, her face betraying no emotion. As her daughter stirred beside her, Celeste gently kissed her forehead and whispered, "Just a little longer, sweetheart." Though she reclined and closed her eyes in an attempt to find respite, her thoughts raced. This was only the beginning, and she was determined not to let the matter end here. While the plane cruised steadily at 35000 FT, the atmosphere in the cabin remained anything but serene. Seated with her daughter cozily nestled against her, Celeste listened to the quiet hum of the engines that masked the turbulence of her inner thoughts. Nearby, first-class passengers maintained a conspicuous silence. Some stole occasional glances, their curiosity piqued by the earlier commotion, while others deliberately kept their distance from the drama. A young flight attendant returned bearing a small tray, softly announcing, "Here's a meal for your daughter," as she gently set it on the table. The attendant paused briefly, as if wanting to offer further reassurance, then simply nodded and stepped away after receiving Celeste's faint smile and quiet thanks. Celeste Mirage unfolded the tray and handed a spoon to her daughter, her movements steady and deliberate as her daughter ate. Celeste Mirage's mind worked through the details of what had just happened. The audacity of being questioned in front of her child, the humiliation of having the police called, and the subtle yet glaring prejudice woven through it all were impossible to ignore. Celeste Mirage had been silent in the moment, but now her resolve was building. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up and saw a reply to her earlier message. It was from a close friend and colleague, someone with influence in corporate law. The message read, Got it. Send me all details when you land. We'll handle this swiftly. Celeste Mirage locked her phone and leaned back in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't someone who sought drama or conflict, but she had always believed in justice and accountability. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about sending a message that people shouldn't be treated differently because of who they were or what they looked like. Meanwhile, in the galley, the supervisor pulled out her own phone and began documenting the incident. She sent a detailed message to her superiors at the airline headquarters, explaining the actions Vesper Rune had taken and the consequences that had followed. She knew the airline leadership would demand answers, and she wasn't about to let this situation spiral further without providing context. As the flight continued, Celeste Mirage noticed the demeanor of the remaining crew. They moved more carefully around her now, their smiles a little too wide, their offers of assistance almost overcompensating. Celeste Mirage saw through it. She appreciated kindness when it was genuine, but she could also recognize fear. They weren't just attending to her. They were trying to protect themselves from the fallout. Celeste Mirage glanced down at her daughter, who was happily munching on her meal, oblivious to the tension around her. She felt a pang of guilt for exposing her to the experience, but quickly brushed it aside. Her daughter would grow up learning that she didn't have to accept mistreatment, and this would serve as an early lesson in standing firm. As the plane reached its cruising altitude, a voice crackled over the intercom. It was the captain, his tone measured and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We hope you're enjoying your flight today. If there's anything the crew can do to make your experience better, don't hesitate to ask." The irony wasn't lost on Celeste Mirage. She raised an eyebrow at the words, but said nothing. Instead, she reached for her notebook, flipping to a blank page. She began jotting down notes, carefully documenting everything: times, statements, actions. Every detail mattered. She wasn't just preparing for herself, she was preparing for what came next. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier with unspoken tension. Celeste Mirage remained quiet in her seat, her hand resting on her daughter's as the little girl played with a small stuffed toy. From an outside perspective, it might have seemed as though Celeste Mirage had moved on, but her mind was sharp, replaying every moment of the incident and what had to come next. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair leaned slightly towards Celeste Mirage. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice careful not to draw too much attention. Celeste Mirage looked up, her expression neutral but polite. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier," the man continued. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you okay? That was unsettling to say the least." Celeste Mirage gave a faint smile, appreciating his concern but unwilling to delve into the details. "Thank you for asking," she replied evenly. "I'm fine now, just focused on getting to my destination." The man nodded, clearly sensing her boundaries. "Well, if it means anything, I thought what happened was completely uncalled for. People should be treated with respect no matter where they're sitting." His voice had a quiet sincerity, and Celeste Mirage nodded in acknowledgement. "Respect shouldn't be a privilege," she said simply. Her words hanging in the air, the man leaned back in his seat, appearing thoughtful. Meanwhile, in the galley, the supervisor was typing furiously on her tablet, submitting a formal incident report. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The airline prided itself on maintaining a pristine reputation, and an incident like this had the potential to spark outrage. If word got out, and with smartphones in nearly every passenger's hand, she knew it wouldn't be long before videos of the scene started circulating online. Meanwhile, in the economy section, whispers were spreading among passengers. Word of what had happened in first class had reached the back rows, carried by flight attendants and overheard in conversations. A young couple seated near the front of the economy cabin exchanged hushed words. "Did you hear what happened?" the woman asked, leaning closer to her partner. "They called the police?" "Police on a pregnant woman in first class of all places," the man frowned. "That's unbelievable. Over what did she even do?" "Nothing," the woman said, shaking her head. "From what I heard, her ticket was valid. They just assumed." The man exhaled sharply, his expression darkening. "That's disgusting." Back in first class, the remaining flight attendants tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but the tension was palpable. Every interaction felt forced, their smiles too bright, their movements overly careful. Celeste Mirage noticed the shift, but didn't acknowledge it. She was focused on her daughter and the notes she was discreetly writing in her notebook. She flipped to a fresh page and jotted down key details. Vesper Rune's exact words, the arrival of the police, the supervisor's intervention. Each moment was recorded with precision. Her pen moved steadily as she constructed a timeline of events. This wasn't just about having a personal record. Celeste Mirage was preparing to hold the airline accountable. She had no intention of letting this incident fade into a simple apology and empty promises. Celeste Mirage's phone buzzed softly beside her, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the screen. A message from her legal contact, a trusted friend who had been instrumental in helping her navigate similar challenges in the past. The message was brief but direct. "I'm already drafting a formal complaint. We'll make sure this is addressed properly. Let me know if you need anything else." Celeste Mirage locked her phone and slid it back into her bag, her resolve strengthening with every passing minute. Celeste Mirage wasn't the type to seek revenge, but she was fiercely protective of her dignity and her daughter's future. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure no one else had to endure the same humiliation. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin, mounting the tension that still lingered across the aisle. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes leaned toward Celeste Mirage. "I just wanted to say that what happened earlier was terrible," she said, her voice hushed but sympathetic. "You handled it with so much grace. I don't think I could have stayed as calm." Celeste Mirage smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "Sometimes staying calm is the only choice." The woman nodded, clearly moved by Celeste Mirage's composure. "Well, I hope they do something about that flight attendant. What she did wasn't right." Celeste Mirage didn't respond to that. She didn't need to. Her silence carried more weight than words, and the woman seemed to understand, retreating back to her seat. As the plane continued its journey, Celeste Mirage glanced out the window at the endless stretch of clouds. The world outside seemed so calm, so detached from the turmoil inside the cabin, but Celeste Mirage knew better. Change didn't come from silence, and she was determined to turn this moment into something meaningful. Unbeknownst to her, the videos taken by passengers had already started circulating on social media, gathering attention and sparking outrage. Celeste Mirage's quiet resolve would soon be matched by a chorus of voices demanding justice. As the plane cruised toward its destination, the groundwork for a much larger battle was already being laid. The plane's journey wore on, but the incident lingered heavily in the air. Passengers had grown restless, whispering amongst themselves about what they'd witnessed. A few discreetly typed out social media posts uploaded snippets of video footage they had captured. In one clip, Celeste Mirage could be seen standing by the galley, her expression calm yet firm as she answered the police officer's questions. Another video showed Vesper Rune's tense interaction with the supervisor. The captions accompanying these posts ranged from disgraceful behavior on Flight 2467 to Prejudice in plain sight. Celeste Mirage, still seated with her daughter, noticed the faint buzz of conversation around her. The occasional glance or quiet murmur didn't escape her attention, but she remained focused on her notes. Her pen moved swiftly as she detailed every part of the incident, her thoughts crisp and organized. She paused to check on her daughter, who had fallen asleep, her head resting on Celeste Mirage's arm. Celeste Mirage adjusted the blanket draped over her and sighed softly, wishing for her child's peace of mind. Meanwhile, in the galley, the supervisor sat in a corner, tapping away on her tablet. She had already sent a preliminary report to the airline's headquarters and was now working on a more detailed account. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she considered the implications of Vesper Rune's actions. This wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a glaring failure of judgment that reflected poorly on the company. The airline couldn't afford to let this slide. She sighed, knowing the weight of what lay ahead. Someone would have to answer for this. And Vesper Rune had already made herself the scapegoat in the main cabin. Whispers were turning into louder conversations. A pair of passengers near the front row were particularly vocal. "I can't believe she called the police overnight. Nothing," one of them said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's insane. What was she thinking?" another replied. "Honestly, this kind of thing happens way too often. People just assume things about others based on how they look. It's disgusting." "Yeah, but she got what she deserved," the first passenger added. The supervisor didn't waste any time. Their conversation trailed off as a flight attendant passed by, giving them a sharp glance. The cabin crew was visibly on edge, their movements more cautious than usual. They avoided making eye contact with Celeste Mirage, though one of them occasionally glanced her way, as if silently offering an unspoken apology. Celeste Mirage noticed, but she didn't react. She had other priorities. Her phone buzzed again and she discreetly checked the screen. A new email had arrived, this time from the airline's public relations department. It was a formal message acknowledging the incident, though its tone was more defensive than apologetic. "We are aware of the situation that occurred on Flight 2467 and are currently conducting an internal review. The airline takes matters of customer service and passenger experience seriously and will take appropriate action following a full investigation." Celeste Mirage's lips pressed into a thin line. It was a carefully worded statement designed to shield the company from backlash, not to take real accountability. She forwarded the email to her legal contact with a brief note. "Predictable. Let's push for a stronger response." She locked her phone and glanced at her sleeping daughter for a moment. She allowed herself to feel the fatigue creeping into her body. It had been an exhausting day, but she couldn't let it end without setting the stage for real consequences. This wasn't just about her. It was about changing a system that allowed people like Vesper Rune to act with impunity. At the back of the plane, Vesper Rune sat alone in the last row, clutching her bag tightly on her lap. Her face was pale, her mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. She had never imagined her actions would escalate to this point. She had thought she was doing the right thing, or at least what she had convinced herself was right in the moment. Now, the weight of her choices felt unbearable. The whispers of passengers passing by on their way to the lavatory didn't help. She caught fragments of their conversation. "Called the police for no reason. Pregnant woman with a kid, can you believe that? How do people like that even keep their jobs?" Each comment cut deeper than the last. Vesper Rune glanced at her phone, tempted to call someone for support, but she hesitated. Who would she even explain this to? Her partner? Her parents? What could she say that didn't make her sound like the villain? She was starting to realize she might be in the first-class cabin. Celeste Mirage's calm demeanor continued to mask her resolve. She wasn't the kind of person to lash out in anger, but she wasn't the kind to back down either. As the flight neared its destination, she began formulating her next steps. The internal investigation promised by the airline wasn't enough. She would ensure that this incident became a catalyst for change, not just for herself, but for anyone who might face similar treatment. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time the message made her pause. It was from a major news outlet. "Miss Mirage, we've been made aware of the incident on your flight. Would you be willing to provide a statement for an upcoming story?" Celeste Mirage's eyebrows lifted slightly. News of the event had already reached the media, and it was gaining traction faster than she had anticipated. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned the screen off and placed her phone back in her bag. This wasn't about sensationalism, it was about accountability, and she would decide how to tell her story on her own terms. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, thanking passengers for their patience and reminding them to prepare for landing. Celeste Mirage fastened her seatbelt and adjusted her daughter's blanket. Her mind was still racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real battle would begin when they landed. The announcement of the plane's descent brought a flurry of activity in the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seats, gathered their belongings, and prepared for landing. But even in the routine shuffle, the tension surrounding what had occurred earlier lingered, unspoken but palpable. Celeste Mirage's focus remained on her daughter, who was still sleeping peacefully against her arm. With gentle movements, she fastened the child's seatbelt and brushed a stray curl from her face. A calm exterior hid the plans forming in her mind. At the back of the plane, Vesper Rune sat rigidly in her seat, her hands gripping the edges of her bag, her knuckles white. She avoided eye contact with passengers walking past her. The reality of her situation had settled in, heavy and unrelenting. Her job, her reputation, and possibly her entire career were now at stake, and for what? A snap judgment. Celeste Mirage stared out the window, her reflection looking back at her, a mix of fear and regret etched into her features. Celeste Mirage, meanwhile, felt the vibration of her phone in her bag. She quietly pulled it out, shielding the screen with her hand. Another message from her legal contact had arrived. News is spreading fast. People are already talking about holding the airline accountable. We'll be ready to file a formal complaint the moment you land. Let's ensure this turns into lasting change. She stared at the message for a moment before locking her phone and placing it back into her bag. It wasn't surprising that the incident had gained traction so quickly. Social media was ruthless, and the videos captured by other passengers had likely already reached thousands, if not millions of viewers. Celeste Mirage didn't seek fame or attention, but she understood the power of visibility. If this situation could bring systemic issues to light, she was willing to face the storm. As the plane began its descent, a flight attendant walked through the aisle to ensure everyone was seated properly. It was Nyx, the young attendant who had been kind to Celeste Mirage earlier. She stopped briefly by Celeste Mirage's row, her eyes soft with concern. "Is there anything I can get for you before we land?" she asked, her voice low and genuine. Celeste Mirage shook her head and smiled faintly. "We're fine, thank you." Nyx hesitated, then added, "I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for what happened earlier. It wasn't right, and I hope you know that not all of us are like that." Celeste Mirage appreciated her words, though they didn't erase what had happened. "Thank you," she replied simply. "I can see that you care." Nyx nodded and moved on, her presence a small but meaningful reminder that compassion still existed, even in moments like these. Celeste Mirage watched her go, silently deciding that Nyx's kindness wouldn't be overlooked when the time came to address the airline. The captain's voice came over the intercom once again, this time announcing their final approach to the airport. Celeste Mirage felt her daughter stir beside her, blinking sleepily as the plane began to lower. "Are we there yet, Mama?" the little girl asked, her voice groggy almost. Celeste Mirage replied, smoothing her daughter's hair and kissing her forehead. Just a little bit longer. As the wheels touched down on the runway with a gentle thud, Celeste Mirage felt a wave of anticipation roll over her. The next steps would be critical. She had kept her composure throughout the flight, but now it was time to act. She had no intention of letting this experience fade into an empty apology. This was her moment to ensure accountability. Once the plane reached the gate, the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the cabin. Passengers began rising from their seats, retrieving bags and preparing to disembark. Celeste Mirage remained seated, allowing the rush to pass. She wasn't in a hurry. Her daughter yawned and stretched, clutching her stuffed toy tightly at the front of the plane. The supervisor stood near the exit, her posture stiff but professional. She made a point of acknowledging each passenger who exited, her smile strained as though she were bracing for an onslaught of questions and comments about the earlier incident. Her eyes briefly darted to the back of the plane, where Vesper Rune was still seated, her face pale and her movements hesitant. Vesper Rune hadn't moved yet, frozen in place as the gravity of her situation continued to weigh on her. She knew she'd have to leave eventually, and the thought of facing the passengers she had offended, or worse, Celeste Mirage, filled her with dread. Celeste Mirage fiddled with the strap of her bag, her mind racing through a few scenarios of how she could salvage what was left of her reputation. Finally, Celeste Mirage stood, taking her bag from the overhead compartment. She helped her daughter down from her seat and adjusted her coat. The passengers around her stepped aside respectfully, their earlier curiosity now tempered with a mix of guilt and admiration. It was as though they recognized the strength in her silence, the dignity with which she had handled the ordeal. As Celeste Mirage approached the exit, the supervisor straightened. "Ms. Mirage," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of unease. "Thank you for your patience today. I deeply regret everything that happened, and want you to know the airline will address this." Celeste Mirage paused, meeting the supervisor's gaze. Her expression was calm but resolute. "I hope you do," she said evenly. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." The supervisor nodded, clearly unsettled by the conviction in Celeste Mirage's words. As Celeste Mirage and her daughter stepped off the plane, a group of uniformed airport security officers stood waiting near the gate. Vesper Rune emerged from the aircraft moments later, her face stricken as the officers approached her. "Miss Rune?" one of them asked. Vesper Rune nodded hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes? We've been instructed to escort you for questioning regarding the incident on this flight," the officer said, his tone professional but firm. Passengers lingering in the terminal turned their heads at the sight, some whispering, others pulling out their phones to capture the scene. Vesper Rune looked around, humiliation complete, as she followed the officers away, her steps slow and reluctant. Celeste Mirage watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She didn't take pleasure in Vesper Rune's downfall, but she knew accountability was necessary. Turning toward the terminal, she held her daughter's hand tightly, her resolve stronger than ever. This was far from over. It was only the beginning. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of disembarking passengers, but whispers about the flight incident rippled through the crowd like a quiet storm. Celeste Mirage walked with her daughter toward the baggage claim area, her steps purposeful yet unhurried. She kept her head high, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder as they weaved through the throng of travelers. Her phone vibrated again in her bag, but she didn't immediately reach for it. She had more pressing matters to focus on behind her. The fallout from the incident continued to unfold. Vesper Rune was led toward a private area by airport security, her face pale and her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, her shame growing with the murmurs of passengers. Some stared openly, others whispered among themselves, their judgment unmistakable for Vesper Rune. The walk through the terminal felt like the longest of her life. Once inside a small, nondescript office, Vesper Rune was seated across from two uniformed officers. One of them opened a file on the desk, his expression neutral but firm. "Ms. Rune," he began, "we've been briefed on the incident during Flight 2467. Before we proceed, do you have anything you'd like to say about what happened?" Vesper Rune opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. She swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she said weakly. "I thought I was following the rules." The officer tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Following the rules? From what we've gathered, the passenger you targeted had a valid ticket and presented no issues. What exactly made you escalate the situation to the point of involving law enforcement?" Vesper Rune hesitated, her mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't sound as hollow as it felt. I thought she didn't belong in first class," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of her words hit her as soon as they left her mouth, and she lowered her gaze, unable to meet the officer's eyes. The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "That's not following the rules, Ms. Rune. That's prejudice, and because of your actions, the airline is now facing a significant backlash, not to mention a legal complaint from the passenger." Vesper Rune's chest tightened at the mention of legal action. "I never meant to cause harm," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake that has consequences," the officer replied sharply. "You'll need to cooperate fully with the airline's investigation. For now, you're suspended from duty, and further action will be determined by the disciplinary committee." Tears welled in Vesper Rune's eyes, but she didn't protest. Deep down, she knew there was nothing she could say to undo what had happened. Meanwhile, Celeste Mirage reached the baggage claim area where her suitcase soon appeared on the carousel. She grabbed it with practiced ease, her daughter clinging to her other hand as they moved toward the exit. Celeste Mirage finally pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with notifications. Messages from her legal contact, missed calls from colleagues, and an email from a major news outlet requesting an interview. She scrolled through the messages, her expression calm but thoughtful. One caught her attention, a statement from the airline's CEO. It was brief and carefully worded, an attempt to contain the situation. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 2467 and are committed to conducting a thorough investigation. We take allegations of Celeste Mirage locked her phone and slipped it back into her bag. The words felt hollow, a carefully crafted PR move to protect the company's image rather than address the real issues. She wasn't surprised. She had dealt with corporate damage control before, but this time she wouldn't let the matter rest with empty promises and vague apologies. As she stepped outside to the pickup area, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver, dressed in a sharp suit, stepped out and opened the door for her. "Ms. Mirage," he said politely, "welcome back. Your meeting has been scheduled as per your request." Celeste Mirage nodded in acknowledgement, helping her daughter into the car before settling in herself. As the door closed behind her, she pulled out her phone again and began typing a message to her legal team. "I've landed. Let's proceed with the formal complaint. Include details of today's incident as well as suggestions for policy reform. This isn't just about me. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else." She hit send and leaned back in her seat, watching the cityscape blur past the window. Her daughter, now awake and munching on a snack from her bag, looked up at her and asked, "Mama, are you okay?" in a small but concerned voice. Celeste Mirage smiled softly and stroked her daughter's hair. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine." But Celeste Mirage knew this was just the beginning. The social media posts, the mounting outrage, the looming legal proceedings, it was all part of a larger storm that would force the airline to confront its failures, and Celeste Mirage would be at the center of it. Not for personal gain, but for justice. This was a fight she was ready for, one that would ripple far beyond this single flight. As the car turned towards the city, Celeste Mirage felt a sense of calm resolve settle over her. The events of the day had been painful, but they had also sparked something larger, something that could lead to real, lasting change. The sedan glided smoothly through the city streets, its interior quiet except for the soft hum of the engine. Celeste Mirage sat with her daughter beside her, the little girl leaning against her mother's side, clutching her stuffed toy. The day's events played over and over in Celeste Mirage's mind, each detail sharpening her determination to act. Her phone buzzed again, another flood of notifications lighting up the screen. Social media had picked up the incident in full force, with hashtags like "Chenan flying while black" and "Justice for Celeste" trending across multiple platforms. Celeste Mirage scrolled briefly through the posts, her expression impassive. Videos from the flight were being shared widely. Some users demanded accountability from the airline, tagging their official accounts and calling for boycotts. Others shared their own stories of discrimination while traveling, amplifying the conversation even further. It was clear that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was becoming a movement. One particular post caught Celeste Mirage's attention. It was from a well-known civil rights advocate who had shared one of the viral videos with a powerful statement. "What happened to this woman is unacceptable, and it happens far too often. Airlines need to do better. Policies must change, and people must be held accountable. This ends now." Celeste Mirage felt a surge of validation reading the post. She wasn't alone in this fight, and the public outrage gave her the leverage she needed to push for meaningful change. She typed out a quick reply to her legal team. "The momentum is building, let's use it wisely. Draft the public statement we discussed and prepare for media inquiries." The car pulled up to her office building, a sleek and modern high-rise in the heart of the city. The driver stepped out to open her door, but Celeste Mirage paused before getting out. She turned to her daughter, who was still clutching her toy tightly, and said gently, "We'll be inside for a little while, sweetie, then we'll go home, okay?" Her daughter nodded sleepily, her trust in her mother unwavering. Celeste Mirage carried her bag and her daughter into the building, where her assistant Echo was already waiting in the lobby. Echo's face lit up with concern and admiration as she approached them. Celeste Mirage asked in a low, urgent voice, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Celeste Mirage replied, calmly adjusting her grip on her daughter. "But we have a lot of work to do. Are the documents ready?" Echo nodded, holding up a thick folder. Everything you requested is in here. Your statement, the timeline of events, and the policy recommendations. I also included contact information for some journalists who've reached out to us. This story is already gaining traction. Celeste Mirage gave a small nod of approval. Good, let's get started. They entered the elevator. Celeste Mirage felt a shift in her resolve. She had always been driven, but today's events had reignited something deeper, a determination to not only seek justice for herself, but to create a ripple effect that would reach far beyond her own experience. Upstairs in her office, Celeste Mirage settled her daughter on a plush couch with a tablet to keep her occupied. Then, she sat at her desk, spreading the documents across its surface. Echo hovered nearby, her focus sharp. "Do you want me to schedule interviews with the press?" she asked. Celeste Mirage considered it for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet. Let's focus on getting the formal complaint filed first. I want the airline to see that this isn't just about one incident, it's about their entire culture. If we go public too soon, they might try to spin the narrative. We need to stay in control." Echo nodded, impressed by Celeste Mirage's clarity and strategy. "Understood. I'll make sure everything is prepared." Celeste Mirage began reading through the complaint, her pen marking sections that needed adjustments. The document was detailed and unflinching, outlining every misstep that had occurred during the flight, from Vesper Rune's baseless assumptions to the unnecessary involvement of law enforcement. It also included concrete policy recommendations, mandatory sensitivity training, a review of internal protocols, and a transparent system for addressing passenger grievances. As she worked, Celeste Mirage's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "This is Celeste Mirage," she said, her tone professional. "Mirage, this is Orion Drake, CEO of the airline," a measured voice said on the other end. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened today. I've been briefed on the incident, and I want to assure you that we're taking this very seriously." Celeste Mirage leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate the call, Mr. Drake," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But apologies alone won't fix this. I trust you're aware that this isn't just about one flight or one employee. This is about systemic issues within your organization." Drake paused, clearly caught off guard by her directness. "You're absolutely right," he said after a moment. "That's why we're launching an internal review immediately. We're also implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff and revising our protocols for handling similar situations." Celeste Mirage was not impressed. "I've heard promises like this before," she said bluntly. "What assurances can you give me that these changes will actually be implemented and that they'll lead to real accountability?" Drake's tone shifted, becoming more earnest. "We'll provide regular updates on our progress, and I'd like to invite you to be part of the oversight committee we're forming. Your insight could be invaluable in shaping these reforms." Celeste Mirage was silent for a moment, considering his words. She didn't trust corporate platitudes, but the offer of a seat at the table was intriguing. It was an opportunity to ensure the changes were more than just performative. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "In the meantime, I expect full cooperation with my legal team as we move forward with our formal complaint." "Of course," Drake replied quickly. "Please know that we're committed to working with you on this." Celeste Mirage ended the call and placed her phone on the desk. Echo, who had overheard parts of the conversation, raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like they're scrambling." "They should be," Celeste Mirage replied. "This is bigger than me, and they know it." Her eyes drifted to her daughter, still playing contentedly on the couch. Celeste Mirage's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about setting an example for her child and ensuring a future where no one had to endure what she did. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The next morning, the sun filtered through the tall windows of Celeste Mirage's office, casting a warm glow over the organized chaos on her desk. Stacks of papers and a glowing laptop screen, and her phone buzzing intermittently were signs of a day that would be as relentless as the last. Celeste Mirage sat at the center of it all, her focus unwavering as she reviewed the final version of the formal complaint drafted by her legal team. Her daughter sat nearby, coloring quietly, and occasionally glancing up at her mother with curiosity. Echo entered the office holding 2 mugs of coffee. She placed one in front of Celeste Mirage and sat across from her, setting a tablet on the table. "The complaint is ready to file," Echo said, her voice tinged with both excitement and seriousness. "We've also received interview requests from 3 major news outlets. They're all looking to feature the story." Celeste Mirage took a sip of her coffee, her mind processing the options. "Hold off on the interviews for now," she said firmly. "I want the complaint filed first. The airline needs to feel the weight of this through the proper channels before we let public opinion take over." Echo nodded. "Understood, but you should know social media is already driving the narrative. People are calling for the airline to release a public apology. There's even a petition circulating demanding policy changes." Celeste Mirage raised an eyebrow in intrigue. "A petition?" she echoed. Echo tapped her tablet, scrolling through the details. "It's already gathered over 500,000 signatures in less than 12 hours. The description mentions your incident as the tipping point, but highlights systemic discrimination in the airline industry as a whole. It's gaining traction fast." Celeste Mirage leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile crossing her lips. She hadn't sought this level of attention, but the momentum was undeniable. What had started as a deeply personal moment of humiliation was now becoming a collective call for justice. "I know we have to approach this carefully and strategically," she said after a moment. "Let's make sure we support those efforts without letting the message get diluted. I'll approve a brief statement for social media later. For now, let's focus on getting the legal process moving." Echo's phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. Her expression shifted slightly as she read the message. "You might want to hear this," she said. "Vesper Rune has issued a public apology." Celeste Mirage's eyebrows lifted in surprise, though her expression quickly returned to neutral. "A public apology?" she echoed. "What does it say?" Echo read the statement aloud. "I deeply regret my actions during Flight 2467. I made assumptions that were both unfair and harmful, and I take full responsibility for my mistake. I want to sincerely apologize to Ms. Mirage, her daughter, and anyone else affected by my behavior. This experience has been a wake-up call for me, and I am committed to learning from it and doing better in the future." There was a pause as the words hung in the air. Celeste Mirage stared at the papers on her desk, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't quick to trust public apologies, especially when they came after a storm of backlash. Still, there was something different about this one. It lacked the defensive tone she had come to expect and carried a hint of genuine remorse. "She's trying to save face," Echo said, breaking the silence. "Do you think it's sincere?" Celeste Mirage folded her hands on the desk, her gaze steady. "Maybe," she said carefully, "but one apology doesn't fix a systemic problem, and it doesn't erase what happened." Echo nodded. So, what's the next step? Celeste Mirage glanced at the clock on her desk. File the complaint, then schedule a meeting with the airline's leadership. If they're serious about making changes, I want to hear their plans firsthand. Echo stood ready to carry out the instructions. I'll get it done. As Echo left the office, Celeste Mirage leaned back in her chair, her thoughts turning to Vesper Rune. She couldn't deny that the apology, if sincere, was a step in the right direction. But it wasn't just about Vesper Rune. It was about a culture that allowed someone like her to act without thinking and then scrambled to justify it afterward. Celeste Mirage wanted more than apologies. She wanted accountability, reform, and measurable change. Later that afternoon, Celeste Mirage's phone rang. The caller ID showed Orion Drake, the airline's CEO. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Drake," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Miss Mirage, thank you for taking my call." Mr. Drake began, "I wanted to inform you personally that the airline has received your formal complaint. We're taking it very seriously and have already begun reviewing our internal policies." Celeste Mirage listened quietly, allowing him to continue. "I also want to assure you that Vesper Rune is no longer with the airline. We've issued a public statement addressing the incident and are working on implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff." Celeste Mirage's voice was steady when she replied, "I appreciate the steps you're taking, Mr. Drake, but firing one employee and promising training isn't enough. This isn't an isolated issue, it's systemic." Mr. Drake sounded cautious. "I understand, and we're committed to doing more. That's why I'd like to invite you to join our advisory board. Your insight would be invaluable in helping us create meaningful change." Celeste Mirage paused, weighing his words. The offer was significant, but she wasn't one to accept gestures without guarantees. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But my focus right now is on ensuring your promises turn into action. I'll need regular updates on your progress, and I expect transparency." "Of course," Mr. Drake said quickly. "We'll provide you with everything you need." After ending the call, Celeste Mirage sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts racing. The pieces were falling into place, but she knew the road ahead would be long. Change didn't happen overnight, and she wasn't naive enough to believe that one meeting or one policy update would fix everything. But this was a start, a foundation to build on. Her daughter approached her desk, holding up a picture she had drawn. "Mama, look," she said brightly. The drawing showed a smiling sun and a plane in the sky, and two figures holding hands. Celeste Mirage smiled, her heart softening. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said as she hugged her daughter. Celeste Mirage felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for her daughter, for other mothers, for anyone who had been made to feel small. It was a fight for dignity, respect, and equality, and she wasn't about to back down. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of activity. Celeste Mirage's legal team finalized the formal complaint and filed it with both the airline and a regulatory body overseeing aviation standards. At the same time, the media continued to pick up the story, amplifying its reach far beyond what Celeste Mirage had initially expected. News outlets ran segments dissecting the systemic biases embedded in the airline industry, using her story as a catalyst for broader discussions about discrimination. Celeste Mirage carefully monitored the coverage, choosing her words wisely. In the few statements she released, she wanted the focus to remain on the larger issues, not just her personal experience. "This is about accountability and change," she wrote in one widely shared post. "My story is one of many, and it's time for these systems to address the prejudice that so many people face." The airline's leadership scrambled to manage the growing fallout. Internal memos leaked to the press revealed tense discussions among executives about how to handle the situation. Employees across the organization were being sent mandatory notices about upcoming sensitivity training sessions, while the company's public relations team worked overtime trying to control the narrative. Orion Drake, the airline CEO, reached out again, requesting a formal meeting with Celeste Mirage and her legal representatives. Celeste Mirage agreed, but on her terms. The meeting would include a detailed presentation of her recommendations for policy changes, and the airline would commit to a public timeline for implementation. She wanted transparency and accountability, not empty promises. On the day of the meeting, Celeste Mirage entered the airline's headquarters with her head held high. She was accompanied by her legal counsel and Echo, who carried a neatly prepared binder filled with documentation of the incident, witness statements, and policy suggestions. The lobby was buzzing with activity, but as Celeste Mirage walked through, heads turned and conversations hushed. Her presence carried a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. In the large conference room, filled with senior executives including Orion Drake, he stood as Celeste Mirage entered, extending his hand. "Ms. Mirage, thank you for coming," he said, his tone respectful. Celeste Mirage shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she replied. "I trust we'll be able to have a productive discussion." As the meeting began, Celeste Mirage laid out her case with precision. She detailed the events of the flight, the actions of Vesper, Rune, and the airline's inadequate handling of similar incidents in the past. She then transitioned into her recommendations: mandatory training, an overhaul of reporting protocols, and the creation of a third-party oversight committee to ensure objectivity in addressing complaints. Orion Drake and his team listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. When Celeste Mirage finished, there was a brief silence in the room before Orion Drake spoke. "Miss Mirage, I won't pretend we've handled this perfectly. Your points are valid and we're committed to making the changes you've outlined." Celeste Mirage's gaze didn't waver. "Commitment is important, but action is what matters. I'll need to see concrete steps being taken with measurable outcomes. Anything less is unacceptable." Orion Drake nodded, his expression earnest. "We'll provide regular updates, and I'd like to formalize your involvement on the advisory board. Your perspective will be invaluable as we move forward." Celeste Mirage paused, considering the offer. "I'll accept, but only if my role comes with the authority to hold your team accountable. This isn't about appearances, it's about results." "Agreed," Orion Drake said firmly. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. Celeste Mirage left the building feeling cautiously optimistic. The airline's willingness to engage with her suggestions was a step in the right direction, but she remained vigilant. Words were easy, actions would determine whether real change would happen. As she stepped outside, Echo caught up with her. "That was incredible," Echo said, her voice filled with admiration. "You were composed, clear, and unyielding. They couldn't ignore you." Celeste Mirage smiled faintly. "It's not about me, Echo. It's about the people who face this kind of treatment without a voice. If this forces even one organization to rethink its practices, it's worth it." Echo nodded, her admiration unwavering. "You've already made a difference. The fact that they're listening to you proves that." Celeste Mirage's phone buzzed as she reached her car. She glanced at the screen, and she saw a flood of notifications, messages of support, articles covering the meeting, and updates from her legal team. One stood out. A journalist had published a detailed piece about her, framing her as a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change. She skimmed the article, her emotions a mix of humility and resolve. This fight was far from over. but she felt the momentum building as she settled into the car with her daughter, who greeted her with an excited hug. Celeste Mirage allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had been exhausting, but she knew in her heart that it was leading to something bigger. Weeks turned into months, and the effects of Celeste Mirage's actions continued to ripple through the airline industry. The airline had begun implementing the changes she had demanded, starting with a comprehensive training program aimed at addressing unconscious bias. Reports from employees and passengers showed promising results. Staff interactions grew more professional and considerate, and complaints of discriminatory behavior began to decline. Celeste Mirage's role on the advisory board became pivotal. She reviewed policies, attended meetings, and worked closely with other board members to ensure that the promises made during the initial meetings were fulfilled. Her presence was a reminder to the airline's leadership that accountability was not a momentary response to bad press, but an ongoing commitment. The media's interest in the story gradually shifted from outrage to inspiration. Celeste Mirage became a respected voice in discussions about systemic bias, her calm yet determined demeanor earning her invitations to speak at conferences and participate in panels. She often used these opportunities to highlight not just her own experience, but the broader challenges faced by underrepresented communities in various industries. Vesper Rune's life had taken a different turn after being dismissed from her position. She struggled with the weight of public scrutiny and her own guilt. She began attending workshops on bias and prejudice, determined to understand the roots of her actions and learn how to rebuild herself as a better person. In a surprising turn, she reached out to Celeste Mirage through a heartfelt email. The message was simple but sincere, Vesper Rune wrote. "I know I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that your courage opened my eyes. I've spent these months reflecting on my actions and educating myself. I hope one day I can be a part of the solution instead of the problem." Celeste Mirage read the email carefully. She didn't reply immediately. Forgiveness wasn't something she gave lightly, especially for actions with such profound consequences. However, she recognized the importance of growth and accountability, even for those who had wronged her. Her reply was measured. "Change begins with acknowledgement, and I hope you remain committed to this path. If your intentions are genuine, use what you've learned to help others. That's where true redemption lies." As Celeste Mirage continued her work, her daughter often accompanied her, watching her mother's resolve with wide, admiring eyes. One evening, after a long day filled with demanding meetings and quiet battles for change, Celeste tucked her daughter into bed. The little girl, her eyes brimming with both wonder and earnest admiration, looked up and asked, "Mama, why do you work so hard?" Celeste paused, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face, and replied in a soft, measured tone, "Because I want to make the world better, not just for me, but for you and everyone else." Her daughter nodded thoughtfully, as if absorbing the weight and warmth of her mother's words. "You already did, Mama," she said, her voice tender and sincere. In that intimate moment, Celeste pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead, her heart swelling with pride and a deep sense of purpose, knowing that every sacrifice was a step toward a brighter future. Later, when the airline issued its final report on the reforms implemented after that turbulent incident, the document became a symbol of transformation. It detailed the significant improvements in passenger satisfaction and employee conduct, and it recognized Celeste Mirage's contributions as a catalyst for change. Praised by industry leaders as a model for addressing systemic issues, the report spread widely, affirming that dignity and respect were no longer negotiable. As Celeste read the report, a rare moment of peace washed over her. a quiet victory after months of hardship. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. The lesson we learn from this content is about the power of persistence and courage in standing up for justice and protecting one's dignity while paving the way for positive change in society. Faced with prejudice and discriminatory behavior, Celeste Mirage stayed true to herself and refused to let injustice diminish her self-worth. By meticulously documenting every detail of what happened and demanding accountability from the airline's leadership, she transformed a painful personal experience into a movement for systemic change that resonated throughout the industry. This shows that one strong voice, when used with purpose and determination, can have a significant impact and inspire a community to fight against unfair treatment. It also emphasizes the importance of listening and learning from mistakes to build a fairer and more humane work environment and society for everyone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.